The Democratic People's Republic of Korea projects an image of absolute, unbreakable unity. State media broadcasts endless parades of marching soldiers and weeping citizens swearing eternal loyalty to the Kim Dynasty, which has ruled the northern half of the Korean peninsula for over 7 decades, surviving the Cold War, famine, and global isolation. The official narrative claims the people and the military stand as an impenetrable fortress protecting the supreme leader. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lies a history of internal plotting, factional warfare, and desperate attempts to dismantle the regime from within. The path to totalitarian control was paved with the blood of political rivals and mutinous generals. The Kim family spent decades ruthlessly hunting down threats to their power, turning the state apparatus into a machine designed specifically for regime survival. From political showdowns in the halls of the Central Committee to heavily armed military units turning their guns toward Pyongyang, the dynasty has faced multiple existential threats. In this video, we're going to be examining the most significant of these threats to the Kim family's rule. The 1953 Korean War armistice left the peninsula as a graveyard of ash and rubble. American bombing campaigns had systematically leveled nearly every major city and industrial center to the north. To survive, the North Korean state relied entirely on emergency shipments of grain and reconstruction materials from Moscow and Beijing. Inside the Workers' Party, officials who had returned from the Soviet Union sought to leverage this dependence. These Soviet-aligned communists, many of whom had served in the Red Army, pushed for a collective leadership model to dilute Kim Il-sung's rapidly expanding personal power. Kim Il-sung prioritized military readiness over the massive humanitarian crisis. He pushed a rigid agenda that directed the nation's meager resources into heavy industry, steel mills, and munitions factories. This approach entirely ignored the severe food and housing shortages starving the civilian population. When the Soviet faction advocated for increased investment in consumer goods and agricultural reforms, Kim aggressively demoted them and replaced them with his blindly loyal wartime comrades. In early 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech denouncing the dictatorial methods of Joseph Stalin. This wave of de-Stalinization swept through the Soviet bloc and emboldened Kim's rivals. The weakened Soviet faction formed an alliance with the Yan'an faction, a group of veteran communists with deep ties to Mao Zedong. Leaders from both groups planned to formally condemn Kim's disastrous economic policies and his growing cult of personality at the August 1956 Central Committee plenum, and their goal was to force a change in leadership and redirect state resources to the starving civilians. The conspirators operated under the assumption of secrecy, but Kim's internal security apparatus discovered the plot weeks in advance. Kim deliberately postponed the meeting to wage a campaign of political warfare, and he bribed uncommitted party members with promises of promotion, used the secret police to coerce opponents, and secured the absolute loyalty of the armed forces to ensure his rivals had no military backing. When the Central Committee plenum convened on August 30th, the atmosphere was suffocating. Yoon Kong-hum of the Yan'an faction took to the podium to deliver the planned criticism, and he barely finished his opening sentences before Kim's loyalists sprang into action. They immediately shouted him down, cut off the microphone, and physically rushed the stage. Realizing they'd walked into a meticulously prepared trap, the conspirators scattered. Knowing that arrest and execution were imminent, several top Yan'an figures drove straight to the border and crossed the Yalu River into China that night to claim political asylum. The incident triggered an immediate international crisis, and the Soviet Union and China dispatched a joint delegation to Pyongyang demanding Kim reverse his purges and reinstate the opposition. Under immense pressure from his two primary benefactors, Kim pretended to comply and formally restored the purged officials to their positions. The moment the foreign delegations left North Korean airspace, though, Kim discarded the agreement and he launched a massive, unrelenting purge across the entire country. His security forces hunted down and executed hundreds of opposition members, sending thousands of their relatives to remote political prison camps. The August faction incident completely eradicated organized political opposition and cemented Kim Il-sung's drive for absolute, self-reliant dictatorial control. A decade after destroying the Soviet and Yan'an factions, Kim Il-sung faced a profound challenge from his closest allies. The Kapsan faction consisted of veteran guerrilla fighters who'd battled the Japanese alongside Kim in the Manchurian wilderness during the 1930s. Led by Pak Kum-chol, the second most powerful figure in the country, this revolutionary elite felt a deep sense of ownership over the state they had bled to create. Unlike the general population, they remembered Kim Il-sung simply as their former commander and considered themselves his equal partners. A severe policy dispute fractured this tight-knit group in the late 1960s when Kim Il-sung introduced the Byongjin Line, directing massive amounts of capital and labor toward turning North Korea into an impregnable military fortress. The Kaspan faction strongly disagreed with this aggressive militarization, and they argued that heavy defense spending was ruining the civilian economy and actively worked to shift economic priorities back toward light industry. When Pak Kum-chol began elevating his own public profile, Kim interpreted these actions as a direct threat, and at the May 1967 Central Committee plenum, Kim launched a blistering surprise attack, accusing the Kaspan leadership of counter-revolutionary activities. State security promptly arrested Pak Kum-chol and his associates, and to ensure absolute obedience moving forward, Kim established the 10 principles for the establishment of a monolithic ideological system, a new doctrine that elevated his words to absolute law and criminalized independent thought. Having crushed his civilian rivals, Kim Il-sung immediately turned his attention to the armed forces. By 1968, the Korean People's Army controlled a massive portion of the national budget and operated with a dangerous degree of autonomy. Defense Minister Kim Chang-bong and Army Political Director Ho Pong-hak had grown increasingly frustrated with Kim Il-sung's constant micromanagement of military affairs. They believed professional soldiers should dictate tactical doctrine and quietly opposed the growing personality cult as a distraction from combat readiness. Senior military officers began holding secret discussions regarding the removal of Kim Il-sung to restore military independence. They planned to use their command over active combat units to force a change in leadership. However, the state security apparatus caught wind of these murmurs. Kim Il-sung executed a sudden, preemptive strike against the military leadership before they could finalize an operational plot. At a hastily convened military committee meeting, Kim accused Defense Minister Kim Chang-bong of building a personal fiefdom and ordered the arrest of dozens of high-ranking generals. The state stripped them of their ranks and sent them to execution grounds or forced labor camps, and Kim replaced the purge officers with unquestioning loyalists, successfully dismantling the final independent institution capable of challenging his rule. As the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, violent ideological shockwaves finally reached the heavily fortified borders of Pyongyang. The catalyst for this new internal crisis originated years earlier through a state-sponsored educational program. During the 1980s, North Korea sent hundreds of its brightest, most promising military officers to study at the Frunze Military Academy and other prestigious institutions across the USSR. These officers were supposed to learn advanced mechanized warfare and modern Soviet tactics. However, they arrived in Moscow during a period of massive political upheaval. They witnessed firsthand the sweeping reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost. They read banned literature, openly debated political theory, and saw the dismantling of the rigid Soviet state apparatus. When these highly educated officers returned to North Korea in the early 1990s, the contrast was jarring. They found their home country trapped in severe economic stagnation and paralyzed by a suffocating cult of personality. They returned just as Kim Il-sung was actively transferring ultimate control of the military to Kim Jong-il. The Frunze educated officers despised this transition, viewing Kim Jong-il as an incompetent, erratic leader who was fundamentally incapable of managing a modern military force or guiding the country. Operating in extreme secrecy, a network of these high-ranking officers began actively conspiring to overthrow the government. Because they were embedded in key command positions within the Korean People's Army, they possessed the operational capacity to execute a coup. They held secret meetings and discussed plans to mobilize their respective units, block the dynastic succession, and implement immediate, sweeping economic and political reforms modeled on the Soviet collapse. They aimed to dismantle the absolute dictatorship and establish a more pragmatic, military-led government. The plot required complex coordination across different branches of the armed forces, which proved to be their fatal flaw. The North Korean state maintains an incredibly dense, overlapping network of surveillance, particularly within the military command structure. The Ministry of State Security intercepted communications between the conspirators and uncovered the plot just as the officers were preparing to finalize their operational timeline. As a result, security forces conducted coordinated, simultaneous raids across the country, arresting dozens of top-ranking generals, colonels, and staff officers implicated in the Frunze network. The state subjected them to secret military tribunals, charged them with high treason, and executed them by firing squad. Kim Jong-il was deeply rattled by how close the conspiracy came to fruition, and he realized that exposure to the outside world, even to allied communist nations, was a terminal threat to his rule. He immediately initiated a massive, systematic purge of the entire officer corps. The regime identified every single military official who had ever studied in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, and the state stripped them of their commands, revoked their party memberships, and exiled them to remote labor camps in the northern mountains, regardless of whether they had any connection to the Frunze plot. By the mid-1990s, with the full dissolution of the Soviet Union, an unprecedented existential threat to the North Korean state occurred. Vital economic aid, like fuel and fertilizer, ceased as the Soviet successor states focused on their own problems. Then, a series of catastrophic floods wiped out the remaining harvest, and the country descended into a devastating famine known officially as the Arduous March. The central state rationing system, the primary mechanism the regime used to control the population, broke down entirely and hundreds of thousands of civilians starved to death. As the famine worsened throughout 1994 and 1995, the central government in Pyongyang failed to provide adequate food, winter clothing, and basic supplies to the frontline soldiers, with whole units reduced to foraging in the mountains or stealing from starving civilian farmers. The 6th Corps, a heavily armed unit stationed in the North Hamgyong province, took matters into their own hands. The political commissars and commanding officers seized control of the local economy, establishing independent, heavily armed cross-border smuggling operations with China. They took over the lucrative mining industries in the region, using soldiers as labor to extract minerals for foreign export. This desperate bid for survival transformed the 6th Corps into an independent economic entity, no longer reliant on Pyongyang for their livelihood, and this financial independence rapidly bred political defiance. According to defectors and intelligence reports compiled years later, the top brass of the 6th Corps formed a concrete conspiracy to mutiny. The starvation of their troops and the total apathy of the central leadership pushed them past the breaking point. They planned to mobilize their artillery and mechanized units, secure the vital port city of Chongjin, and initiate a full-scale armed rebellion against the government of Kim Jong-il. The plots allegedly involved assassinating loyalist generals in the region and seizing control of key infrastructure along the eastern seaboard. However, the conspiracy unraveled just before the launch date. The regime maintained those overlapping layers of surveillance we talked about even during the famine, and a political officer within the 6th Corps tipped off the Military Security Command in Pyongyang. Kim Jong-il realized the severity of the threat and immediately dispatched a specialized, heavily armed unit of loyal troops to North Hamgyong. These loyalist forces infiltrated the 6th Corps headquarters under the cover of night and executed a sudden, violent raid. They arrested the entire command staff before the rebel generals could issue mobilization orders to their troops, and they executed the ringleaders and completely disbanded the 6th Corps. The surviving soldiers were scattered and integrated into other tightly monitored units across the country to prevent them from regrouping. The regime subsequently locked down North Hamgyong province entirely, subjecting the civilian population and local officials to intense interrogations and purges that lasted for years. Now, if you weren't aware, Kim Jong-il had a fear of flying, preferring traveling in a heavily armored luxury train. His travel schedules were guarded state secrets, and in April 2004, Kim took this rolling fortress to Beijing for a highly secretive meeting. On April 22nd, the train crossed back into North Korea, passing through the town of Ryongchon. Several hours after the Supreme Leader cleared the station, a catastrophic explosion leveled the area. The blast obliterated the railway station, nearby schools, and thousands of homes. North Korean state media quickly claimed 2 cargo trains carrying ammonium nitrate and fuel oil collided due to human error, killing over 150 people, at least according to North Korean sources, and the real numbers could be much higher. International intelligence agencies immediately noted the suspicious timing though. The explosion occurred on the exact route and day of Kim Jong-il's return journey, and analysts suspected a highly coordinated assassination attempt. Conspirators likely planted explosives to detonate as the Supreme Leader passed, but a scheduling change or technical delay caused the bomb to go off after Kim had already left the blast radius. The regime's frantic response fueled this theory, and security forces launched a ruthless nationwide crackdown on mobile phones, shutting down the cellular network and confiscating devices. Investigators believe the perpetrators used a modified phone as a remote detonator, and the state also conducted sweeping purges within the railway ministry. While the true nature of the Ryongchon explosion remains classified, it stands as the closest anyone came to physically eliminating Kim Jong-il. When Kim Jong-il died of a sudden heart attack in December 2011, his young, entirely inexperienced son, Kim Jong-un, assumed absolute control of the state. He was in his late 20s and lacked the decades of brutal political maneuvering that had defined his father and grandfather. The older generation of military hardliners, men covered in medals who had run the country during the famine years, viewed the new leader with deep skepticism. Vice Marshal Ri Yong-ho represented the old guard. As the chief of the general staff, Ri held immense, unchecked power. Under Kim Jong-il's military-first policy, the armed forces had acquired control over the country's most lucrative trading companies, foreign currency operations, and mining exports. Ri Yong-ho controlled this vast wealth, and Kim Jong-un recognized that he could never truly rule the country as long as the military maintained its own independent economic empire. He needed to strip the military of its financial assets and shift those resources back to the Workers' Party to consolidate his own power. In July 2012, Kim Jong-un issued a direct order demanding the military hand over control of its economic assets to the civilian cabinet. Vice Marshal Ri Yong-ho refused the order, and he viewed it as an insult and a direct attack on the armed forces' prestige and institutional survival. In response, Kim Jong-un sent a heavily armed contingent of elite troops led by Cho Yong-hae, the newly appointed director of the military's General Political Bureau, to physically arrest the vice marshal. They arrived at Ri's compound in the center of Pyongyang, but Ri's personal security detail refused to stand down. A fierce, close-quarters firefight erupted in the heart of the capital city between the arresting forces and the vice marshal's guards. The clash resulted in dozens of casualties, with bullet holes scarring the surrounding government buildings. The loyalist forces eventually overwhelmed Rhee's security detail through sheer numbers and firepower, and state media abruptly announced Ri Yong-ho's resignation due to an unspecified illness the very next morning. He was never seen in public again. With the military leadership decapitated and brought to heel, Kim Jong-un turned his attention to his own family. Song-thaek, Kim Jong-un's uncle by marriage, had functioned as the de facto regent during the turbulent transition of power, and he controlled the powerful organization and guidance department, managed the country's vital diplomatic relationship with China, and oversaw a vast, highly profitable network of coal and mineral export businesses. Jung had accumulated massive personal wealth and cultivated a deeply loyal following within the Workers' Party bureaucracy, and he began to operate independently of his nephew. He placed his own loyalists in key government positions, diverted state funds to his own projects, and expanded his control over the national economy. Foreign diplomats often noted that Jung seemed to be the real power behind the throne, and Kim Jong-un recognized this shadow government as a threat. The young leader orchestrated a spectacular, unprecedented public downfall. In December 2013, armed guards stormed the Politburo meeting. In a highly publicized spectacle broadcast repeatedly on state television, they dragged Song-thaek out of his seat and out of the auditorium. The state subjected him to a swift, secret military tribunal, and the regime released a brutal, detailed list of charges, accusing him of forming a treacherous faction, mismanaging the national economy, selling state resources at dirt-cheap prices, and actively preparing a military coup to overthrow the government. The state executed Song-thaek using an anti-aircraft gun at a military academy on the outskirts of Pyongyang. The heavy munitions physically obliterated the second most powerful man in the country, and the regime then initiated a bloodbath, executing hundreds of Jiang's associates, family members, and business partners. They recalled diplomats from overseas postings simply because they were tied to Jiang's network, arresting them the moment they stepped off the plane. The regime sent a clear message to the elite. Absolutely no one, not even the supreme leader's own family, was safe from execution if they posed a threat to the throne. By this point, Kim Jong-un realized that the most potent threat to an absolute dictatorship rarely comes from a foreign army. A rival claimant to the throne can cause an existential crisis for the ruling leader, and this was the shadow that Kim Jong-nam cast over his half-brother's reign. Living in exile in Macau, the eldest son of Kim Jong-il occasionally spoke to the foreign press, suggesting the North Korean system needed Chinese-style reforms. The regime decided to eliminate this threat in the most public way possible. In February 2017, two women approached Kim Jong-nam in the crowded departures hall of the Kuala Lumpur International Airport and smeared VX nerve agent, one of the deadliest chemical weapons on Earth, onto his face. He died in agony within minutes. However, the killing backfired by creating a new, even more radical threat in the form of Kim Jong-nam's teenage son, Kim Han-sol. Kim Han-sol represented the first modern alternative to the Kim family's rule. He was young, Western educated, and had the right family bloodline. Following his father's murder, a highly secretive and militant dissident group known as Free Joseon sprang into action. This group, composed of elite defectors and former intelligence operators, successfully extracted Kim Han-sol and his family before North Korean hit squads could reach them. Free Joseon soon moved to actively dismantle the regime's international nervous system. In February 2019, they launched a daring tactical strike against the North Korean embassy in Madrid, Spain. 10 members of the group stormed the compound in broad daylight, physically restraining the staff and seizing the embassy's secure communication hardware. The attackers focused their efforts on the commercial attaché, attempting to force a high-level defection that would shatter the regime's internal morale. It occurred just days before Kim Jong-un was set to meet United States President Donald Trump in Hanoi for a high-stakes nuclear summit. For Kim Jong-un, the existence of a militant shadow government with its own claimant to the throne remains perhaps the most dangerous internal threat his family has ever faced. The history of the Kim dynasty is defined by aborted uprisings, intercepted plots, and silent, devastating purges. From the chaotic factional battles of the 1950s to the high-tech security crackdowns of the modern era, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea maintains its grip on power through a ruthless application of survival mathematics. The state functions as an intricate, inescapable web of overlapping surveillance agencies. Military commanders spy on party officials, political commissars spy on the military, and the secret police watch everyone. This architecture of suspicion ensures that a conspiracy can't broaden beyond a whisper before the state identifies and crushes it. The Kim family engineered a political and military system that leaves its citizens and its elites far too fragmented, impoverished, and terrified to organize a successful rebellion. The regime survives today not through the genuine devotion of its people, but by perfecting the brutal, unforgiving science of coup-proofing. Anyways guys, let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Which of these plots did you find the most interesting? As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.